What I want to do is talk about a festival that we have running connected to Ars Electronica at the other end of Linz. At the moment it's called Sleep 48, and it's a collaboration with the art space. You don't want to look at that. Sorry, this is old school humanities where we don't have any PowerPoint. I'm just going to read. And the space is the space Stadtwerkstatt, which is an artist space, an artist collective, where we're running a small festival looking at the aesthetic possibilities of sleep. So not sleep in the classical sense of sleep as something that produces dreams and therefore becomes meaningful, but sleep as an active daily practice that produces aesthetic effects, that produces experiences of the world. So is anyone here active sleeper? You regularly sleep? Okay, so this might be of interest to you. If you're asleep now, this talk is succeeding already. So what I want to do is start from a story of a scientific experiment that produced an error that enlarged our understanding of sleep. So in sleep science, a classic example of sleep would be the story of Hans Berger, who's a German scientist, a German psychiatrist, starting at the end of the 19th century, who became very active in the 1920s. He was the inventor of what we now call the encephalograph. Berger imagined it would be a means of scientifically detecting telepathy, based on what he imagined to be psychic energy. So this is an example of kind of vitalist theories of the end of the 19th century. By looking for the existence of telepathy, he found electrical activity in the brain, what we now call the alpha waves and the beta waves. The first time the alpha wave, which is this kind of slow wave of electrical activity that connects different parts of the brain, was named after him as the Berger wave. So the story of this error is a long one. Berger trained initially as a doctor, but got bored with medical training, and in search of some excitement, he enrolled in the cavalry. Unfortunately, he got too much excitement and fell from his horse into the path of a unit drawing a cannon. He was almost killed by this accident, but luckily the other people in the army stopped their horses just in time. He didn't eventually die. But the key thing that happened was that at that moment, apparently, his sister had an immediate feeling that he was in mortal danger and got her father to send him a telegram to check that he was still alive. So remember the days when you couldn't just ring someone up? You sent a telegram to check whether they're still alive. So this introduces an error bar. You know, are you still alive at the point the telegram arrives, and so on. So Berger firmly believed this to be an example of telepathy. But he was wise enough to know that you don't have a long career as a scientist if you start proclaiming the grounding force of your experiments is a crank theory. So what he did was repress this hypothesis to private notes and began his experiments returning from the cavalry to psychiatric practice in Jena, where he had a day job as a psychiatric doctor. In the night, he would work almost in a kind of hacker-like style as an inventor and researcher. He worked for a decade before presenting his work. He discovered the alpha wave in 1924, published it in 1929, and he was regarded as a crank and an eccentric, someone who wasn't working with stable theories, stable objects, and was largely ignored until his work was confirmed by others in 1934 to 1939, where it was incorporated eventually into standard models of the brain. One of the things, as an aside for my kind of academic colleagues here to note, is one of the things that Berger early discovered in monitoring the electrical activity of the brain. He finds in his notes that making the facial expressions associated with thinking does not result in actual electrical conductivity associated with thought. So if you're faking thinking, don't actually imagine it to arise. So we've had error in this discussion as a form of misinterpretation, error as a false idea, but we can also see error as a form of translation that happens in his work. So when we think about electroencephalography, which is the putting of sensors on the scalp, and in Berger's early case was actually inserting electrodes, silver electrodes, into brain tissue, these translations become very important. How do you translate from the electrical device into scientific understanding? So alongside translation, there are findings of equivalence that are common in science. So how things become interpretable by number, how things become translated into data, and there are errors of mapping from one system of understanding to another, or one media system into another. So Berger, in order to analyze the electrical activity of the brain, had to translate it into sets of numbers, into sets of data. So Berger is able to translate the inscrutable operations of epilepsy, for instance, and a lot of the initial subjects he was looking at were epileptics who showed strong electrical activity in the brain. He translates these inscrutable operations into wave patterns that are divulged by means of harmonic analysis, such as the Fourier transform. So a quite old mathematical set of tools from the 18th century. Electrical media then mediate between mathematical techniques for transforming frequency over time and a form of seizure. So again, a third form of translation. In doing so, these electrical media were able to verify the similarity between such seizures and artificially induced epileptiform attacks induced by the use of cardiazole, which is a chemical used to treat schizophrenia prior to electroconvulsive therapy and other means, by means of a common reference point to the waveform. So the waveform that is measured by Berger becomes the thing that we treat, becomes the standard by which we then compare epilepsy, the action of a chemical that produces a waveform that is similar to an epileptic attack, and by which patients are then compared to each other. So the number, the waveform, the media systems that are used to interrogate the brain all become points of translation. So there are 4 layers of translation here. What Michael earlier referred to as error bars become very active in this point. So there are translations between number, electricity, waveforms, chemical performance in the body, and medical conditions that produce similar results but are not the same and are in different bodies. So by now we're familiar with the computational subsumption of signifying systems that are grounded in the information theory of Claude Shannon. This is a form of transposition and a general media system which allows for forms of translation. We have numerous systems that are now translated into general systems of equivalence of the computer, where one system, the elements and associative rules of medium A, can be reproduced in the elements and associative rules of medium B. And this is the classical source of error in digital media, since the functions and elements being mapped may not fit or may create an emergent condition which we can call a weird machine. And this weird machine, these kind of emergent machines that produce unexpected translations, unexpected forms of conjunction, are what we live in as a society to some extent, but also what we can test for its aesthetic potency. So it's in some of this spirit of testing the aesthetic potency of emergent machines, emergent systems that we're interested in working with the question of sleep. Sleep is very much something that we all know a lot about. We're all relatively active in it. And it's something that emerges out of the interaction of numerous systems in the body, such as the homeostatic system, the circadian system, and others that in turn arise out of the evolved interaction of the human body as it stands at the moment. So this festival that we've developed is to try and think about sleep as an aesthetic practice. So first of all, this is a category error. Sleep is a very primary activity of most species, and in humans roughly takes up a kind of third of our life. But to see it as an aesthetic or an artistic grounds is something that is a relatively novel approach. So it's a collaboration with the artist Shuli Chang and the Linz-based organization Stadtwerkstatt, whose building is next to the Ars Electronica Center. The slogan of the festival is art for sleepers, art by sleepers, and art as sleep. What we've done with the festival is to produce a sleep beer, that is a brewed beer that has St. John's wort in and stone pine cones in collaboration with Café Strom at Stadtwerkstatt and Torbrau in Ottenheim. Food that encourages sleep because it contains plant analogs to different sleep hormones produced by the chef Taro. Sleep races in which people competitively sleep, something we hope will become an Olympic sport in the next few years, which is done in collaboration with the Linz Kepler University Hospital and Dr. Andreas Kleintorfer there, where people wear a polysomnograph, so a thing that measure 12 data points of sleep, and the speed of their sleep, the depth of their sleep, the harmonic nature of the data they produce is analyzed by doctors in order to judge who slept the best. We also include working on confluences of brain activity in separate bodies by Qualia Industries. And we have 2 nights of performances for sleep by sound artists where the audience is given beds and sleeps whilst the sound is played. And we have also sleep tunnels by the group No Architects for cost-free accommodation during Ars Electronica. Sleep is increasingly by lawyers being seen as a basic human right, and sleep deprivation, as we know, is a form of torture. So production of expensive events in which people can't afford accommodation, we could say, need some kind of response to. And we have a group of rough sleepers, so people taking sleep into places that it's excluded from, such as banks, shopping centers, and exhibition spaces, and directly going to sleep in these places. So what we're interested in is this condition of multiple translations from aesthetic practices to the experiences and individual and collective experiences of sleep to biological and cultural and social practices of sleep as an emerging aesthetic form. We see this as composing a shifting pattern of mismatches and confluences of interpretation that very much mirrors the action of sleep in the body, but it also works at the level of aesthetics and of experience as an active category error that produces new kinds of experience. So we're interested, and to finish, we'll say that we're interested in an aesthetics without a classically constructed subject, so a non-conscious subject, a subject that is not awake, not alert, and not perceptually attentive or contemplative, towards an aesthetic subject that is alive, alert, dynamic, composed of multiple interacting systems, but operating by different modes and registers of sensation and sense-making. In this context, error becomes a set of interference patterns between interpretative and performative frameworks and techniques and the different scales of realities that they take part in, translate, and induce. Here, aesthetics, and particularly art, is a form of direct action in sensing and sense-making that takes these multiple compositional layers, transformations, and forces into account and works with them. Okay, thank you.